The doctors called her just a triage nurse, a woman who sorted the waiting room and answered the phones, and the senior attending laughed at the worn black tourniquet she kept clipped to her lanyard, and not one of them knew that the quiet woman they wrote off had once run mass casualty triage at derailments and blast sites on the far side of the world, and that before the night was over, she would be the only person still moving who could keep their patients from bleeding out on the floor of their own emergency room. Her name was Elena Marsh, and most of the staff called her Lena, and the senior physicians, the ones who had decided long ago that a triage nurse in her late 30s was a fixture and not a colleague, did not really call her anything at all, because to them she was part of the department, as ordinary as the rows of chairs in the waiting room or the soft chime of the triage queue at the front desk. She was 38 years old. She had been a nurse for 16 of those years, the last 4 of them on the triage side of this emergency department, working the long evening rush because the rush was hers, and the work was honest, and nobody up the chain had the energy at the busiest hour of the night to tell her how to do a job she had been doing since before half of them had finished their training. She moved through the department the way deep water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate, and on the night everything changed, she was exactly where she always was at the start of a shift, at the long triage desk under the bright ceiling lights, clipping a worn matte black tourniquet to the faded webbing loop on her lanyard before she opened the queue. The tourniquet was old. The strap had gone soft and pale at the edges from years of hard use, and clipped beside it on the same loop was a small dull coin, plain metal worn smooth, the kind of thing a person is given and does not buy, though none of the doctors had ever looked closely enough to wonder what it was. She checked it the way some people check a wedding ring when they are bracing for a long day, a small private touch. And then she snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and went to open the doors. Dr. Alan Whitlock was 51 years old and had been the senior attending on the evening service for as long as anyone could remember, and he had decided years before that Elena Marsh was, at best, useful furniture. Not a danger in his mind, an inconvenience. A holdover. He had watched her write her triage notes out longhand on paper cards, even after she entered them in the computer, and he had watched her stand at the mouth of the ambulance bay for a full 30 seconds, just reading the empty driveway before a shift got busy, and he had watched her pace that bay on her own brakes, stepping off distances under her breath, mapping where she would put litters if the whole drive filled at once, like a woman expecting a war, and he had filed all of it under the same heading, which was strange, behind the times, not quite right. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous, a clever man who had spent 25 years being the smartest person in every room, and had come to believe that the title on his coat was the same thing as the truth, and that a woman without his letters after her name was, by simple arithmetic, beneath his attention. He looked at a triage nurse writing in pen under a fluorescent light with a soldier's tourniquet on a frayed cord around her neck, and he saw a person playing dress up at a job that mostly meant sorting coughs from chest pain, and he felt, in the easy, weightless way you feel it about someone you have never once imagined being, a flicker of contempt dressed up as concern. "You know we keep trauma kits stocked in every bay," he said to her one evening, with a smile that was almost kind. The kind of smile you give a child showing you a drawing, nodding at the black tourniquet on her chest. "You don't need to carry your own little battlefield gadget around my waiting room, Elena. This isn't a war zone." And Elena had looked down at the small black thing on her lanyard and then back up at him, and she had said, "I know," and nothing else, and gone back to her card, and he had taken her silence for the surrender of a woman who had no answer, when in fact It was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply learned, across 16 years, that the people who needed to tell her she was out of her depth were almost never the people who would listen if she told them why she was not. So she let it stand. She let nearly all of it stand. That was the thing about Elena Marsh that none of them understood, and that one night would teach them all at once. She did not need them to see her. She needed her patients sorted right, and she needed her hands steady, and she needed the tourniquet on her chest, though she could not always have told you why she still carried it after all these years, only that the day she stopped would be the day she would need it. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing and felt that quiet anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the room up when it starts to fall. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring. And that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Because what happened in that emergency room before the night was through is the kind of thing that if you had been standing at that triage desk, you would never have looked at a quiet nurse the same way again. There were 2 younger doctors who followed Whitlock's lead, the way junior residents always follow the senior, a clean-cut young man named Owen and a sharp, quick young woman named Dana, both of them in their late 20s, both of them brilliant on paper, both of them good people who had simply been taught by the whole shape of their training to trust the screen over the person and the protocol, over the quiet woman who could not quote them the year a guideline had changed. They were not bad. That is the part that matters, the part the story keeps coming back to, that the people who dismissed Elena Marsh were not villains, they were just wrong. And they were wrong in the specific way that smart, confident people are wrong, which is the hardest kind of wrong to fix. Because it does not feel like wrongness from the inside. It feels like competence. It feels like being right. And on most nights, on an ordinary emergency floor where the patients came in 1 or 2 at a time and the problems arrived tidy out of a textbook, their kind of wrong cost nothing at all. The department ran. The monitors beeped their steady green beeps. The triage nurse sorted the waiting room and was easy to ignore, and everyone was comfortable inside the arrangement, and nobody, not one of them, ever once imagined hundreds of broken people coming through those doors in a single hour. There was a third figure in the small theater of Elena's working life, and he was in some ways the worst of them, because he never raised his voice. His name was Roland Mercer, and he was 48, and his title was something long and modern that came down, in the end, to numbers. He wore a tailored gray suit and carried a tablet and moved through the hospital like a man reading a balance sheet that happened to be made of people. He had heard, from Whitlock and from others, about the triage nurse who ran her own little surge drills in the empty ambulance bay at the slow hour of the shift, who timed herself laying out imaginary casualty lines across the concrete, who had once asked, in a staff meeting, whether anyone knew how fast the department could clear its hallway beds if 100 patients arrived at once, and who had been told, with a small laugh, that this was a community emergency room, not a war zone. Roland Mercer did not find it charming. He found it a liability, because a nurse doing unscripted things in his department was a variable he could not put in a column, and the columns were the whole of his religion. So he had begun, quietly, to build a file. He noted the longhand cards as a documentation inconsistency. He noted the drills as unauthorized use of clinical space. He noted the tourniquet in a memo as personal equipment not approved by the supply committee, a phrase he was rather proud of, and he scheduled a meeting, and in that meeting, in a bright conference room with the blinds half down, he slid a single sheet of paper across the table to her and told her, in the gentle, reasonable voice of a man who has never once bled, that the hospital appreciated her enthusiasm, but that she needed to operate within her scope. Elena read the sheet. It was a formal write-up, the first of her career, and it cited the drills and the cards and the gadget, and at the bottom there was a line for her to sign acknowledging that she understood. She set the paper down, she reached up, without quite deciding to, and her thumb found the small worn coin clipped beside the tourniquet on her lanyard, and she turned it over once, the way she always did when a room was about to make a mistake, and the narration of her own life went very quiet in her chest. That coin was older than Roland Mercer's entire career in this building. It had been pressed into her palm on a runway at the end of the worst week of her life by a man with 3 days of beard and blood dried brown to the elbow, who had told her to keep it because people who do what she had just done do not get medals, they get to go home, and the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. She did not say any of that. She looked at Roland Mercer's reasonable face and his tailored gray suit, and she picked up the pen and she signed the paper, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not waste your strength arguing with a man who is sure, and you save it for the night the building decides whether you were right. What none of them knew, what was written in no file in this hospital, was where Elena Marsh had spent the 8 years before she had ever clocked in at a triage desk. She had been, in those years, something the personnel office could not have categorized if it tried. She had carried a different kind of bag and worn a different color and answered to a call sign instead of a name, and she had gone to the places the news showed for 90 seconds before moving on. The collapsed apartment blocks and the flooded districts and the rail lines twisted into the shapes of the things that had hit them, and she had run triage in the worst conditions a human body can be asked to work in, with no power and no imaging and no resupply and more dying people than there were hands. She had learned out there the thing that no classroom can teach and no protocol can hold, which is how to walk into more catastrophe than a person can possibly fix and not freeze. How to look at 100 screaming wounded and feel the panic rise in your own throat and set it down, deliberately, like a tool you cannot use right now, and start sorting. She had learned that in a true mass casualty event, the most dangerous instinct a clinician has is the urge to save the first person they see, because the first person they see is rarely the one who will die in the next 10 minutes. And the whole grim art of it is to walk past the screaming to reach the silent. She had buried friends who never learned to walk past the screaming. And then, for reasons she kept folded up small and did not take out at work, she had come home and traded the call sign for a name tag and taken the quietest, honest job she could find at the front of a building and let everyone assume she had never done anything harder than hand out cough drops. There was one person in the department who suspected there was more to her, and her name was Nadia, the night charge nurse, a warm, round-faced woman in her 30s with dark hair in a low bun and an instinct for reading people that no one had ever put on her evaluation. Nadia had worked beside Elena for 3 years, and in 3 years she had watched 100 small things the doctors never noticed. She had watched Elena's eyes go flat and calm in exactly the moments other people's went wide, watched her voice drop lower and slower when a case turned bad instead of climbing the way panic climbs, watched her hands stay perfectly still over a crashing patient while a brand new residence shook. She had watched Elena glance at the ceiling tiles and the exit signs and the oxygen shutoffs in any new room, once automatically, the way some people check for the nearest coffee. she had never asked. You did not ask Elena things, you simply noticed that the answers were there, behind the quiet, and that they were not the answers a normal Ursum would explain. Once, a cocky new hire had rolled his eyes at Elena's longhand cards and her tourniquet and muttered something about the burned-out old triage lady, and Nadia had taken him aside, very calmly, and told him to leave her be. That the day was going to come when he would want to be standing exactly where Elena Marsh was standing, and that he had better hope she still bothered to teach him anything by then. The new hire had laughed it off. Nadia had not been joking. The night it happened began like any other, which is the way these nights always begin. It was a Thursday in the early autumn, and the evening rush had come in on schedule, the predictable tide of a city emptying its offices and its factories and its trains into the few hours before dinner, and the waiting room had filled with the ordinary catalog of human trouble. A man with chest pain he had been ignoring since lunch. A woman with a wrist she had broken on a curb. A delivery driver with a deep cut across his palm. A feverish college student. An older man whose blood pressure had wandered somewhere it should not be. A young woman with a migraine so bad she could not open her eyes against the lights. Elena worked the front of it the way she always did, calm and fast and unremarkable to anyone watching, calling them up one at a time, laying 2 fingers on a wrist while she asked the questions, reading 100 small signals the form did not ask for, the color of a lip, the set of a jaw, the particular way a person holds the part of them that is most wrong. She moved the talkative ones to the chairs, and she moved the quiet gray ones to the back, fast. And twice that evening she moved someone faster than their numbers said she should have, on nothing she could have written down, and twice that evening she was right. The second time, it was the older man with the wandering blood pressure. The triage screen had him as a low priority, stable vitals, a routine recheck, and a tired resident had already waved him toward the long line. Elena looked at him for the length of one breath and saw something the screen did not see, a faint grayness at the edges of him, a stillness in the way he sat that was not calm, but the opposite of calm. The body going quiet, the way a body goes quiet when it is busy with something serious underneath. She did not announce it. She simply walked him back herself, passed the line into a bay, and put him on a monitor, and called it in flat and low, and 4 minutes later, the something underneath announced itself in a way no one could miss. And because she had moved him when she did, there was a team standing around him when it happened, instead of a clerk finding him slumped in a chair an hour later. Whitlock arrived in the middle of it, took over with brisk competence, stabilized the man, did good work, real work, and afterward, when it was done and the man was alive and going up to the unit, Whitlock looked at the chart and frowned and said, to no one in particular, that Triage had over-prioritized a stable patient and tied up a bay. And somebody ought to look at the metrics on that. Nadia opened her mouth. Elena caught her eye across the bay and gave the smallest shake of her head, and Nadia closed her mouth, and the moment passed, and Whitlock walked away certain he had just watched his own skill save a life, which, in part he had, never once wondering whose judgment had put the man in front of him alive enough to save. That was how it went. The whole long, slow education the department refused to receive. Elena would see the thing first and move, and someone with letters after their name would arrive in time to finish what her seeing had started and take the win and file her foresight under nuisance. She did not need the win. This is the thing that the people who run the world by titles can never quite believe about the people who run it by competence, that some of them genuinely do not need the credit, that the work itself is the thing, that a patient alive at the end of a shift is a complete sentence with no need of anyone's signature. Elena had learned, in the years she did not talk about, exactly how little the credit was worth and exactly how much the work was worth, because she had done the work in places where there was no credit to be had, where you saved who you could save and carried the rest in you forever, and no one ever wrote your name down at all. A community emergency room on a Thursday was, by comparison, a gentle place. She was grateful for the gentleness. She had earned a little gentleness. She had no way of knowing that the gentleness had exactly 2 hours and 11 minutes left to run. Around 6 in the evening, the rush thickened, the way it does, and Owen and Dana, the two young residents, were running the back of the department with the bright, tireless confidence of people who have not yet met the night that takes the confidence away. They were good. It bears repeating, because the story is not interested in making fools of them, only in showing the gap between what they knew and what was about to be asked of them. They knew their algorithms cold. They could work up a chest pain and read a film and push the right drug in the right order, and they had, between them, run perhaps 3 or 4 genuinely sick patients, each in their short careers, one at a time, with the full machinery of a modern hospital arranged behind each one like a pit crew. What they had never done, what almost no one in an American emergency room has ever actually done, was stand in front of more catastrophe than the building could hold and decide, in the space of seconds and without help, who lived. They did not know that this was a different skill entirely. They did not know that it could not be reasoned out from first principles in the moment, that it had to already be in the hands and the spine before the moment arrived, drilled in until it ran without the conscious mind, the way Elena had drilled it into hers in the empty ambulance bay on 100 slow nights while they laughed at her from the doorway. They thought, the way the young and the lucky think, that being smart would be enough. They were about to find out that being smart is never enough, not for this. That for this you need something older and quieter and far more expensive, paid for in a currency they had never been asked to spend. At 8 minutes past 6, 2 blocks from the hospital, on the elevated commuter line that ran in toward the city center, a packed evening train carrying somewhere near 400 people took a curve at a speed it should not have, and the lead cars came off the rails. Inside the emergency department, at first, nothing happened at all. That is the part people never understand about a disaster, that it does not announce itself to the people who are about to be buried in it. There was no boom they could hear over the climate system and the monitors and the ordinary noise of a busy room. There was only, a moment later, a single short tone from the radio at the charge desk, the dispatch channel, a clipped flat voice that most of the staff did not even register over the hum, requesting any available units to a reported derailment with multiple casualties, location 2 blocks out. Owen heard it and did not look up from his chart. Dana heard it and thought vaguely that it sounded like a job for the ambulance crews and the trauma center across town. The way you think a fire across the city is someone else's fire. Whitlock, in the back, heard the word casualties and assumed, reasonably, the way his whole training had taught him to assume, that the system would do what the system does, that patients would be triaged at the scene and distributed sensibly across the region's hospitals, and that some manageable number of them might, eventually, trickle to his door. Not one of the doctors understood in that first quiet minute what the words multiple casualties 2 blocks out actually meant when you were the closest open doors to 400 people who had just been thrown the length of a train. Not one of them understood that the system they were trusting to protect them was, at that exact moment, 400 people short of being able to. Elena understood. Elena had gone completely still at the triage desk the instant the tone sounded. The pen stopped over the card, her head turned a half degree toward the radio, and something went quiet behind her eyes that Nadia, glancing over, recognized at once and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach to see. Elena had heard that flat dispatch voice say those exact words in 3 different countries, and she knew, the way you know the weather is about to break, precisely what was coming, and precisely how little time they had before it arrived. She did the arithmetic in under a second, the brutal arithmetic she had hoped she would never do again. 2 blocks. 400 people. The nearest doors. No mutual aid surge plan rehearsed in this building beyond a binder no one had opened. The walking wounded would self-present first, on foot, within minutes, because frightened people who can walk always walk toward the nearest lights, and the ambulances with the truly dying would come right behind them, and there were going to be more patients through these doors in the next hour than this department saw in a week, and the people in charge of it did not yet know they were already losing. She set the pen down. She reached up and closed her hand around the worn black tourniquet on her lanyard, once, the way another person might cross themselves, and she breathed out, slow, and set the fear down where she had learned to set it. If you've made it this far into Elena's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Because up to now, you have seen a competent woman swallow insult after insult and keep her dignity, and that is something, but it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next 10 minutes when the doors of that quiet emergency room blow open and the wounded come through faster than anyone can count. And 3 brilliant doctors who have spent years certain of everything discover that all of it, the letters and the lectures and the lab values, has abandoned them at once, and the only person in the room who knows what to do is the triage nurse they wrote up for carrying a tourniquet. There is no way you walk away from this story once you have seen what she does when the wounded start to arrive. The first one came through the doors 4 minutes later, on his own 2 feet, and he set the tone for everything after. He was a man in his 40s in a torn business shirt, one side of his face sheeted in blood from a scalp wound, holding his own arm at an angle arms do not go, and he was not screaming, he was talking, fast and bright and wrong, asking where the bathroom was, asking if someone could call his wife, the particular cheerful dissociation of a man whose mind has not yet caught up with what has happened to his body. Behind him, through the glass, the lights of the ambulance bay swung as the first vehicles arrived, and behind the man, on foot, came the others, 2 and then 5 and then a dozen, limping and staggering and carried and led. A torn, ragged tide of people in office clothes and commuter coats with the dust of a wrecked train still on them, and the bright, ordinary waiting room with its chairs and its cue screen filled, in the space of 90 seconds, with more blood and noise and raw human fear than it had held in the entire 4 years Elena had worked there. A woman was screaming a name over and over. Someone was on the floor near the doors and not moving. The man with the torn shirt sat down, suddenly, in the middle of the floor, still asking about his wife, and his bright wrong talking began to slow. And the department froze. Not from cowardice, from the simple human fact that nothing in their training had prepared them for the shape of it, for the all-at-onceness, for the way a true surge does not arrive as a series of patients, but as a single overwhelming wall. Owen came around the corner and stopped dead, a chart still in his hand, his face going pale and slack as he looked at the waiting room, and his mind tried and failed to find the algorithm for this, because there is no algorithm for this on the screen. The screen assumes one patient and infinite resources, and what stood in front of him was infinite patients and no resources at all. Dana went to the nearest person, the man bleeding from the scalp on the floor, and knelt by him and started doing for him exactly what she had been trained to do: a careful, thorough assessment, airway, breathing, circulation, talking to him gently. And in any other circumstance, it would have been good medicine, and it was, at that moment, precisely the wrong thing. Because while she gave one stable man her careful, complete attention, 3 people she had not yet looked at were dying quietly along the wall, and she did not know to walk past him, because no one had ever taught her that walking past was the job. Whitlock came out of the back at a near run, took in the room, and began to shout, orders that scattered and contradicted, calling for the trauma surgeon who was 20 minutes away, calling for a second attending who was not coming, calling for resources the department did not have, his voice climbing, and the climbing of it told every nurse in earshot that the man in charge had no idea what to do, and the fear in the room doubled. Because a frightened crowd takes its temperature from the loudest authority, and the loudest authority was coming apart. And into the center of that, while the doctors froze and shouted and knelt over the wrong patients, walked the triage nurse, and she was not frozen at all. What the room saw, in the seconds after, it would spend the rest of the night trying to understand, and the rest of their careers remembering. Elena Marsh stepped up onto a chair at the front of the waiting room, and she used the first tool she had ever been given, the only one that works before any other, her own voice, raising it, but not in panic, in a flat, enormous parade ground command that cut clean through the screaming and stopped it. 3 words, the same 3 words she had used on 4 continents. Listen to me. And something in the trained absolute certainty of it, the complete absence of fear in a room drowning in fear, made every face turn toward her, the wounded and the staff and the doctors all at once, the way people in a falling building turn toward the one calm voice. If you can hear me and you can walk, she said, into the silence she had made, stand up and walk through that door on the left, and a nurse will meet you. If you can hear me and you can walk, you go now. And it was not cruelty. It was the opposite of cruelty. It was the first act of someone who knew that the only way to find the dying was to clear away everyone who was not. And a third of the room, the walking wounded, the bright talking ones, rose and moved toward the door. And in 10 seconds, the chaos thinned by a third, and the truly broken were suddenly visible against the floor. And Elena was already stepping down off the chair and moving toward the first of them, reading the room the way she had been trained to read it, not with her heart, which wanted to go to the loudest, but with the cold, drilled part of her that went straight to the quiet. The first person she reached was a young woman slumped against the base of the wall, conscious, gray, one trouser leg dark and glistening, and a spreading stain beneath her on the floor that told Elena everything before she even knelt. A major bleed, an artery, the kind of wound that empties a person in minutes, and that no amount of careful assessment will help if the assessment comes before the bleeding stops. Owen had drifted over, drawn by the obvious severity, and he was already reaching for the supply cart, already starting the right and far too slow process of finding gauze, finding a kit, finding the things the system told him to find, and Elena did not wait for any of it. Her hand was already at her chest. In one motion she had the worn black tourniquet off the loop on her lanyard, and she dropped to her knees in the spreading dark and slid it up the young woman's thigh high above the wound, and cranked the windlass down hard, harder than it looks in any classroom. Hard enough that the young woman cried out, and the glistening pump of red from the legs stopped, simply stopped, in the time it took Owen to turn around with an unopened package in his hand. "It's 6:14, mark the time on her," Elena said to him, flat and even, not unkind, She's a red. She goes to bay 2. Tell them arterial thigh. Tourniquets on. Do not loosen it. Go." And Owen, who outranked her by every measure the hospital recognized, looked at the stopped bleeding and the tourniquet and the woman who had done in 4 seconds what he had been 3 minutes from doing, and some part of his certainty cracked clean across, and he did the smartest thing he would do all night. He stopped arguing with the universe about what was supposed to be happening, and he did what she said. That was the hinge of it, the moment the night turned, though no one had time to notice it as it happened. Because Owen moved, and the moving worked, and the woman lived, the rest of them began, one by one, to orient on the only fixed point in the room, the calm woman in navy scrubs kneeling in the blood, who clearly, unmistakably knew exactly what she was doing. Elena did not ask for command. Command simply flowed to the competents, the way water finds the low ground, and she took it without a flicker of hesitation, because she had held it before in far worse places, and she knew that the worst thing a person who knows what to do can do in a disaster is wait politely to be put in charge. She came up off her knees and she began, in a voice that carried without shouting, to build a machine out of the frightened people around her. She put Nadia at the doors as the sorting point, the single funnel every new patient would pass through, because Nadia could read people and would not freeze. She sent Dana, pulled gently but firmly off the one stable man she had been tending, to run the red zone, the dying, with a 2-sentence briefing that was worth more than a year of lectures. Stop the bleeding you can see, open the airways that are closed, and do nothing else. Do not assess, do not chart, do not treat anything that is not killing them in the next 5 minutes. Just keep them alive until we can come back. She told Whitlock, and this took a particular kind of nerve, to stop shouting and to go run the resuscitation bays in the back where the worst of the salvageable would go. To do the one thing he was genuinely the best in the building at, the deep, complex saves, and to let her feed him the patients who needed them, and Whitlock, his face a war between affront and the dawning animal understanding that he was drowning and she was not, went. And then Elena Marsh stood at the center of her overwhelmed emergency department in the spreading noise of the worst night of its history, and she did the thing she had been built for in the years no one here knew about. She ran the triage. She walked the growing rows of the wounded at a pace that looked almost unhurried and was in fact ruthlessly fast, and she sorted them, laying a hand on each, reading each in the 2 or 3 seconds each one could be given, and she spoke a single color over each that sent them flowing to the right place. Red for the ones who would die without immediate intervention, but could be saved. The arterial bleeds and the closing airways and the tension chests. Yellow for the serious but stable. The broken bones and the deep lacerations and the head wounds that could wait their turn. Green for the walking wounded already filing into the side room. And, twice, with a stillness in her that the staff would never forget and never quite forgive the necessity of. The quiet word that meant there was nothing to be done, the patients too far gone to save with what they had, who could only be made comfortable while the ones who could be saved were saved first. She did not flinch from those two. That was the cost she had paid for long ago and carried in the coin on her lanyard, the terrible knowledge that triage is not about saving everyone. Because everyone cannot be saved, it is about saving the most, and that the person willing to make that arithmetic out loud, in the open, while everyone else looks away from it, is the most important and the loneliest person in the room. The second wave hit at 6:26, and it was worse than the first, because the first had been the walking and the lightly hurt who could carry themselves to the lights, and the second was what the ambulances brought. the ones who could not walk, the crushed and the impaled and the ones pulled from the folded cars, and they came through the bay doors on stretcher after stretcher with the paramedics talking fast and scared because the scene itself was still producing casualties faster than the trucks could move them. Elena met the first stretcher at the doors beside Nadia and read the patient in a glance. A young man, chest crushed against something, struggling for each breath with a desperate sucking effort, his neck veins standing out like cords, one side of his chest barely moving, and she knew this one, knew it cold. A tension building in the chest cavity that was squeezing the life out of him from the inside and would kill him in another minute or two, and she knew that the fix for it was a thing that lived, in this hospital, behind a wall of permissions and physician orders and a procedure tray, none of which existed in the next 60 seconds. She did not hesitate. She called for Whitlock as she moved, loud and sharp, "I need you." Now, tension pneumo, and she had the young man's shirt open and her fingers counting down his ribs, finding the space, by the time Whitlock arrived. And what happened next was the first moment the senior attending truly saw her, because she did not step back and hand him a frightened patient and a problem. She handed him a patient already prepped, the landmark found, her finger on the exact spot, and she said, fast and flat, the precise size and location, the way a scrub nurse who has done it 1,000 times feeds a surgeon, and Whitlock, running on instinct now, did the decompression, and the young man's chest heaved and filled, and his color came back from the dead gray edge, and Whitlock looked up at the triage nurse across the gurney with an expression that had no name yet, because the thing he was beginning to feel did not fit anywhere in the file he had built on her. "Where did you learn that?" he said. Not a challenge now, a real question, almost lost in the noise. And Elena was already turning away to the next stretcher, and she said over her shoulder, in the same flat working voice, "Later," and was gone back into the flood. And Whitlock stood for 1/2 second looking after her before the next dying patient pulled him back under, and the question stayed in him. A small stone dropped into a deep well. Falling, it went on like that for what the clock would later say was 93 minutes, and what felt, to everyone inside it, like both a single held breath and an entire year. The supply room emptied. They ran out of the manufactured tourniquets within the first half hour, and Elena, without breaking stride, began improvising them the way she had improvised them in places with no supply room at all. Cravats and triangular bandages wound tight around a windlass made of a pen, a pair of scissors, the leg of a pair of trauma shears, teaching 2 terrified volunteers in 15 seconds each how to twist and tie and hold, building a little assembly line of hemorrhage control out of frightened civilians and the contents of a dozen first aid drawers. They ran low on cervical collars, and she showed Dana how to improvise stabilization with rolled towels and tape. The blood bank could not keep up, and she ran the cooler herself, allocating units the way she allocated everything, to the ones it would save, not the ones who needed it most, which are not always the same thing, and the difference between them is the whole of the art. When the overhead lights in one corridor flickered and dropped to the dim red of emergency power as the surge tripped something in the building's electrical system, she did not pause for even a beat, because she had done all of this in the dark before, and her voice simply came through the gloom, steady and certain, calling locations and colors and names, a fixed point you could navigate by, and the staff navigated by it. The world, of course, did not stop sending its ordinary emergencies just because a train had come off the rails, and somewhere in the thick of the second hour, the test got harder in a way that none of the protocols account for. A car pulled up hard outside the bay, nothing to do with the wreck, just the random cruelty of timing. And a frantic man half carried his wife through the doors, a woman in her 60s clutching her chest and going gray, a heart attack in full progress, arriving into the middle of a mass casualty event that had already consumed every resource the building had. The man was screaming for help, screaming that his wife was dying, and he was right. She was. And in an ordinary hour, she would have been the sickest patient in the department, and 6 people would have descended on her at once. But this was not an ordinary hour, and Elena had to do, in the space of 3 seconds and in front of the woman's terrified husband, the single hardest thing in all of triage, which is to hold 2 truths at once: that this woman's life mattered exactly as much as every other life in the room, and that the room did not have enough hands to give her everything she needed without letting someone else die. She did not freeze, and she did not falsely promise, and she did not let the husband's panic move her off her arithmetic. She got the woman onto a monitor and into a chair in the Reese's corridor with one quick order, started the first and most important interventions herself in under a minute: the aspirin, the line, the read of the rhythm, and assigned her to Whitlock's zone with a flat, clear handoff the instant he had a free pair of hands, threading one more desperately sick human being into a machine already running at the absolute edge of its capacity. And she did it so smoothly that the woman lived, and the husband, who would tell the story for the rest of his life, never knew how close his wife had come to being the patient there was no one left to save. And the husband was its own problem, because the frightened and the grieving are always part of the scene, and a mass casualty event generates them faster than it generates patients. He would not leave his wife's side, and he was in the way, and he was loud. And in his terror he grabbed at a passing resident and nearly pulled a tray of instruments to the floor, and Elena handled him the way she had learned to handle the 100 frantic husbands and mothers and sons she had met at the edges of catastrophes across the world. Not by ordering him away, which never works, but by giving him a job. She put a hand flat on his chest, firm, grounding, and she looked him dead in the eye and told him, in a voice that left no room for argument, that his wife needed him to do one thing, that she needed him to hold her hand and keep her calm and tell her she was going to be all right, and that this was the most important job in the room and only he could do it. And the man, drowning in helplessness, seized the job like a drowning man seizes a rope, and sat and held his wife's hand and stopped being a hazard and started being a comfort, and the small chaos he had been generating simply dissolved. Nadia watched her do it and shook her head, because it was the kind of thing that does not look like skill, that looks like nothing at all, and is in fact one of the hardest skills there is. The management of human fear in the middle of human catastrophe, and you cannot learn it from a screen. You can only learn it in the places where the fear is real and bottomless, and you have to move through it all night long. And the staff changed as the night ground on, the way people change under a person who knows what they are doing. The fear that had doubled when Whitlock came apart had been replaced, gradually, by something Elena had seen take hold before in desperate places, a grim, competent calm that flows downhill from a calm commander, and the residents who had frozen 90 minutes ago were now moving with hard new purpose, doing more and better work than they had ever done, because she had freed them from the impossible burden of deciding everything and given them each one clear job and the steadying knowledge that someone was holding the whole. Owen ran his red zone and stopped bleeds he would not have known to prioritize that morning. Dana ran her airways and kept people breathing and did not once go back to over-treating the stable, because she had learned, in the hardest possible classroom, to walk past the screaming. Nadia held the door and sorted the flow and did not let the machine clog. And at the center of it, the triage nurse moved through the worst night of all their lives like deep water, slow and certain and saving life after life after life. And somewhere in the third hour, the people who had spent years looking straight through her began, one after another, to understand that they had been working alongside someone they had never once seen. Roland Mercer arrived in the middle of it. He had been called in, as administrators are, to manage the optics of a disaster, and he came through a side door in his tailored gray suit with his tablet under his arm and stopped, as everyone stopped, at the sheer overwhelming sight of it, the bloodied rose, the improvised tourniquets, the red emergency light in the far corridor, the controlled, desperate motion of a department running far past its limits. And then his eyes found the center of it, and he saw, to his visible confusion, that the person directing his emergency department, the person every doctor and nurse in the room was orienting on and obeying, was the triage nurse he had written up 3 weeks earlier for operating outside her scope. For a moment, the disaster and the chain of command collided in his mind, and the chain of command won, because it always had. And he crossed the floor to her with a tight official expression, and he said, in the low controlled voice of a man worried about a lawsuit, Elena, you can't be running clinical operations. This needs to be physician-led. Where is Dr. Whitlock? You are not authorized to. And he got that far before something happened that he did not expect. Whitlock cut him off. Whitlock, who had spent years agreeing with every word Mercer had ever said about the triage nurse, looked up from the resuscitation bay where he was elbow deep in keeping a man alive, his gown soaked, his certainty long since burned away and replaced by something cleaner, and he said, loud enough for the room, she is authorized. I'm authorizing her. She has incident command. Anybody who has a problem with that can take it up with me when we're not drowning. And he went back to his patient. And Roland Mercer stood there with his tablet and his scope of practice memo in a room that had just, with one sentence, rendered all of it meaningless, and for the first time in the entire story he had nothing to say, because the numbers he ran the world by had no column for what was happening in front of him. And somewhere underneath the affront a far more uncomfortable feeling was beginning, which was the suspicion that he had spent 3 years building a file on the single most valuable person in his building. The question everyone was now silently asking got asked out loud, finally, by a paramedic, a grizzled veteran of the city's worst calls, who had been running stretchers in from the scene for 2 hours and who stopped on his way back out to watch Elena reduce a dislocated shoulder and improvise a chest seal in the same 30 seconds. And who said, to Nadia, not quietly enough, who is she? Where did a triage nurse learn to run a mass cast like that? I've worked disasters for 20 years, and I've seen exactly 2 people move like that, and they were both. And he stopped, because Elena had glanced at him. Just once, a flat, steady look, and he was a man who knew that look, had worn it himself, and he understood that he had wandered up to the edge of something she did not talk about, and he nodded, a small soldier's nod of apology and recognition, and he picked up his stretcher and went back out into the night. But the question hung in the air now where everyone could hear it. How does a triage nurse know how to do that? And the room, working all around her, began to wait for the answer the way you wait for a held note to resolve. The trapped man came in just after that, and he was the one who would, without meaning to, pull the whole truth out into the light. The fire crews had been cutting people out of the wreck for hours, and the worst of them, the ones pinned in the folded steel, came last. And this one came in still partly attached to a section of train. A young man in his 20s in ordinary commuter clothes, his leg crushed beneath a folded slab of seating frame that the rescue crews had cut away from the car with him still in it because they could not free the leg at the scene without losing him. He was pale and shocky, and his leg, what they could see of it, was a ruin. And he was conscious, and he was terrified, and the problem he presented was the single hardest problem of the night, because the crushed and trapped limb was both the only thing keeping him from bleeding to death and the thing that was poisoning his blood and stopping his heart the longer it stayed trapped. A vise with no good way out, the kind of grim, impossible field problem that Elena had faced exactly once before, in a collapsed building on the other side of the planet, on the night that had given her the coin. She knelt by the trapped young man, and she did not let her face show any of it. The recognition, the old grief that rose up in her like water in a flooding room, and she took his hand, and she told him her name, which she almost never did, and she told him he was going to feel her doing things that hurt, and that every one of them was a thing that was going to get him home. And she went to work. And while her hands did the work fast and exact, setting the lines, pushing the fluids, getting ahead of the poison that would flood his system the moment the weight came off the leg, getting blood ready and the bicarbonate ready and the calcium ready for the stopped heart she knew was coming, if she got the sequence wrong, the part of her mind that was not needed for the work went, the way it always did at moments like this, to Marcus. Marcus had been her partner for the last 3 of her field years, a big, calm, unhurried man a decade older than her, who had taught her most of what she knew that no book held, and the two of them had run triage together at the worst scenes on 4 continents, and there had been, between them, the particular wordless trust of people who have each, more than once, had the other's life in their hands. It was Marcus who had taught her to walk past the screaming. It was Marcus who had taught her that the calm is a gift you give the people around you, that fear is contagious, and so is steadiness, and you get to choose which one you spread. It was Marcus who, on the night a 6-story building came down on a marketplace full of people, had crawled with her into a void in the rubble to reach a man pinned exactly the way this young commuter was pinned now. The same V's, the same impossible arithmetic, and the two of them had done together the thing that had to be done, and the man had lived, and they had come out filthy and shaking into the dawn, and Marcus had pressed a small dull challenge coin into her hand, one of his own, and told her to keep it, that people who do what they had just done do not get medals, they get to go home. And the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. 3 weeks after that, on an ordinary road, on a quiet day, in the stupid random way the world takes the best people, Marcus had not gotten to go home. And Elena had carried the coin and the tourniquet he had taught her to never be without every single day since, through the leaving of the field and the long, quiet years at the triage desk. A man's whole legacy worn smooth against her chest, and she had never told a soul at the hospital that the gadget the senior attending mocked and the administrator wrote her up for was the only grave she had. He had left her a letter, too. She had not been there when he died. And afterwards, someone had given her an envelope with her name on it in his blunt, careful hand. The kind of letter people in that work sometimes write and leave with their things in case the random day comes. And she had carried that folded letter in the inside pocket of every jacket she had owned since, soft now and worn through at the creases, and she had read it so many times she did not need to unfold it to hear it. It was short. It was not sentimental, because he had not been. It said that if she was reading it, then it had happened, and that she was not to carry it, the weight of the ones they could not save, because she had carried more than her share and saved more than anyone would ever know. It said that the work was not the medals and was never going to be the medals, that the work was the next person, always and only the next person. The one in front of you right now who could still be saved. And it ended with the line she heard now, kneeling in her own city's emergency room with her hands inside the worst night of a stranger's life, the line that had walked her through every dark hour of the years between, do the next necessary thing, and then the one after that, and that is the whole of it. That is how you carry it, one necessary thing at a time until the sun comes up. She breathed out. She did the next necessary thing, and then the one after that. She got him out. When the call came that the structural team had finally stabilized the cut section enough to lift it, she had him so completely prepared, every line in, every drug drawn up in order on the tray beside her, the tourniquet she had placed high on the thigh, ready to be cinched the instant the weight came off, that when the slab finally rose and the ruined leg came free, and his heart did exactly what she had known it would do and stopped, she was already pushing the calcium and the bicarb and calling the compressions in the same calm, flat voice, and 90 seconds later, while a brand new resident wept with relief he could not afford yet, the young man's heart stuttered and caught and held, and he was alive, and he would stay alive, because the woman the hospital had decided was just a triage nurse had once crawled into a collapsed building beside a man who was gone now and learned, in the worst place on earth, precisely how to bring this one home. Not everyone came home. That has to be said, because the story would be a lie without it, and Elena would be the first to insist on it. There was a woman in the red zone, perhaps 50, who had been doing well, whose bleeding they had controlled and whose numbers had been climbing back toward life, and who crashed without warning in the 4th hour from an injury hidden deep inside her that none of them could have seen in time, and Alina was at her side within seconds and ran the code herself, hard and expert and absolutely complete, every right thing in the right order for 40 minutes, and the woman died anyway, the way people sometimes do, past the reach of anyone's hands. And for just a moment, when she finally called it, when she said the time of death in the flat, steady voice and stepped back, the staff around her saw the cost of what she was, saw it cross her face and go quiet behind her eyes, the particular grief of the person who carries the arithmetic, and then they saw her do the hardest thing any of them had ever witnessed a human being do, which was to set it down deliberately, the way you set down a tool you cannot use right now, and turn and go to the next patient, because the next patient could still be saved, and the dead woman could not. And somewhere a man she had buried had once told her that the work was the next person, always and only the next person. She did the next necessary thing. The new resident who had wept earlier watched her do it and understood, finally, what the job actually was and what it cost, and what it meant that this woman had been doing it quietly at their triage desk for 4 years while they called her burned out. By the 5th hour, the wave had crested. The scene 2 blocks away had given up the last of its trapped. The trucks were coming in empty now and not going back out, and the great choking flood of the wounded had become, gradually, a finite number of patients in beds and bays who had been sorted and stabilized and were being worked methodically by a department that had been turned in the space of one night from a frightened crowd into one of the finest trauma teams that had ever existed inside those walls, and the thing that had turned it stood at the center of the room in navy scrubs gone black with other people's blood, still calm, still steady, still calling the next necessary thing. The count, when they finally had time to make it, was staggering. More than 140 patients through the doors in under 5 hours. The kind of surge that closes departments, That becomes a case study in everything that went wrong. And in this one, in this small, understaffed community emergency room that should, by every reasonable expectation, have been overwhelmed into chaos and loss, the survival numbers were going to come out. When the reviews were done, almost impossibly good. Good in a way that the experts who studied it afterward would struggle to explain without using the word that the hospital's own records did not. Contain, which was that on the night the train came off the rails, this department had, by pure accident, been run by one of the best mass casualty triage officers alive. The people who could explain it were starting to arrive. The Regional Disaster Response Coordination had spun up hours before, and as the immediate crisis eased, the senior figures began to come through. The ones who run these things from the outside, and among them, a little after 11 at night, walked a man in a heavy turnout coat and a battered helmet, gray-mustached and weather-beaten, and calm in the specific way that only people who have done this for 30 years are calm. The incident commander who had been running the rescue operation at the wreck itself and who had come, now that his scene was clearing, to coordinate with the hospital that had taken the brunt of it. He came through the ambulance bay doors and into the wrecked and exhausted department, and he stopped, and he looked around at it with the experienced eye of a man assessing how a site had been run, and what he saw made his eyebrows go up. Because he had seen a great many disaster receptions in his life, and most of them were a mess, and this one, for all the blood and exhaustion, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of someone who had run it by a doctrine he recognized in his bones. He saw the casualty flow. He saw the color-coded zones still holding. He saw the improvised tourniquets done a particular correct way, and he began, frowning slightly, to look around the room for the person who had to be responsible. The person who had done this, expecting some flown-in disaster specialist, some military trauma team that had self-deployed, and his eye traveled across the room and snagged, and stopped, on a woman in filthy navy scrubs. He went very still. The room, which had been a churn of motion all night, seemed to the people in it to slow around the two of them, the weathered man in the turnout coat at the doors and the exhausted woman at the center. Though nothing actually slowed, it only felt that way afterward in the telling. He took a step toward her, and another, his eyes moving over her the way a man's eyes move when he is matching a face in front of him against a face from a long time ago, from another country, from the worst and most important days of his own life. He took in the way she stood. He took in the tourniquet on the loop at her chest, the worn black field tourniquet with the strap gone pale at the edges, and the small dull coin clipped beside it, and his weather-beaten face did something complicated, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but the room had gone quiet enough by then to hear it. Every doctor and nurse and the administrator in his gray suit and the two young residents, all of them watching the strange recognition unfold without understanding it yet. "I know you," he said, and Elena, who had not stopped working, who had a chart in her hand and was already turning toward the next thing, went still in her turn and looked at him, really looked, and the room watched something cross her own face, recognition answering recognition across a span of years and an ocean. "I know you," the old commander said again, and he came the last few steps to her, and he said a word that no one in that hospital had ever heard. A word that was not Elena and was not Marsh and was not nurse. A call sign, two clipped syllables, the name she had answered to in the places she did not talk about, and he said it the way you say a name you thought you would never get to say to its owner again. And Elena Marsh, after a long moment, gave the smallest nod, which was its own kind of answer. I served with people who served with you, the commander said. And now he was speaking half to her and half, without quite meaning to the stunned room, because he was a man who understood instinctively that a wrong was being righted in front of him and that it needed witnesses. I was at the relief staging the year of the big quake. They talked about you. The triage officer who ran the collapse line for 3 days without sleep and got a survival rate out of that scene that nobody believed when it came across the wire. They taught the way you sorted. After, they taught it to me. He looked around the wrecked department at the holding zones and the controlled aftermath of a surge that should have been a catastrophe. And he understood exactly what he was looking at, and he looked back at her, and the next thing he did slowly and deliberately and entirely on purpose in front of all of them. The old incident commander came to attention, this gray, weathered man who had run 100 disasters and bowed to no one, and he brought his hand up in a slow, precise, unmistakable salute, and he held it to a triage nurse in blood, blackened scrubs, in a community emergency room, and he said quietly, "Ma'am, it is an honor to finally put a face to the call sign. I have been hearing about you for 15 years. And the room understood. All at once, the way a room understands, the doctors who had looked through her, and the residents who had pitied her, and the administrator who had built a file on her. Every one of them understood at the same instant exactly who had been standing at their triage desk for 4 years, exactly whose hands had been on their patients all night, exactly what the gadget was that the senior attending had mocked and the policy had forbidden. The woman they had decided was the least important person in the building was, and had been, all along, the most, and not one of them, in that moment, could find a single thing to say. Elena did not enjoy it. That is the part that mattered most about her, the part the whole long night had been building toward, and it would have disappointed anyone hoping for a scene of triumph. She did not draw herself up. She did not look at Whitlock or at Mercer or let a single flicker of vindication cross her face. She looked, for a moment, deeply and simply tired, the tiredness of someone who has carried a great weight for a long way and has just had it acknowledged and finds that the acknowledgement does not make the weight any lighter, only less lonely. And then she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was the next necessary thing. She gave the old commander a small nod, a soldier's nod, equal to equal, that said more than any speech, and then she turned back to her department, because there were still patients in those beds who needed working, and she said, in the same flat, steady voice she had used all night, as if nothing at all had just happened, "We've still got 6 in the yellow zone who need reassessment. Let's not lose anybody in the paperwork." And the spell broke, and the room came back into motion, and the work went on. But it went on differently now, because everything had changed, and everyone in that room knew it. Whitlock found her an hour later, when the worst was truly over and the department had begun the long, slow exhale of a crisis ending. He had taken off his ruined gown. He looked older than he had that morning, and humbler, in the way that men are sometimes humbled not by being defeated, but by being shown the true size of something they had been too small to see. He stood in front of her for a moment, the senior attending who had mocked her tourniquet and called her useful furniture, and he did not make excuses, which was the one decent thing left for him to do. And he did it. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I was wrong about you for years, and I said things, and I want you to know that I know it." He stopped, and then he said the thing that cost him the most, the thing that was the real apology. Tonight, when it started, I froze. I stood in that doorway, and I had no idea what to do, and you knew exactly what to do. And you ran my department, and you saved my patients, and you covered for me while you did it, and you never once made me feel it. I don't know how to thank you for that." And Elena looked at him, and there was no cruelty in her, none. The night had burned away whatever small satisfaction another person might have taken, and she said simply, "You did good work tonight, once you had room to." That chest decompression saved that kid. "You're a fine doctor, Alan." She let that stand a moment. And then, because she was who she was, and because the work was always the point, she added, quietly, "If you want to thank me, let me teach the next one. Let me run drills in that bay with the residents, on the clock, so the next time this happens, and there will be a next time, the whole department knows what to do, and it isn't just one tired nurse standing between your patients and the dark." And Whitlock, who 3 weeks before had laughed at her drills, said, "Yes, God, yes, teach all of us." Roland Mercer never quite apologized. Men like Mercer rarely do, because the apology would require them to dismantle the entire structure by which they understand their own importance, and that is more than most people can do in a single night or a single lifetime. But something in him had shifted, all the same, and it showed in the only language he had. The write-up disappeared from her file. No one ever saw him remove it, but it was gone. The drills were approved in a memo as a new departmental disaster preparedness initiative, written up in his careful institutional language as though it had been his idea all along, which Elena let him have, because she did not care whose idea the world thought it was. She cared that the residents would be ready. And weeks later, when the regional review held up that small understaffed emergency room as a model of mass casualty response, when the survival numbers came out as good as the old commander had known they would be, it was Roland Mercer who stood at the podium and accepted the recognition on behalf of the institution, and he did not mention Elena's name. And Elena, in the back of the room in her navy scrubs, did not mind, because she had stopped needing her name said out loud a long time ago, in a place where no names were said at all. The people who mattered knew. That was enough. It had always been enough. The days after a thing like that are strange, quieter than you would expect, the world resuming its ordinary shape around a hole that only some people can see. The department went back to its Thursdays, its chest pains and its broken wrists and its feverish students, the gentle catalog of human trouble resuming as though the night had been a fever dream, except that it had left marks on everyone who was there. The two young residents were not the same. Owen, who had frozen in the doorway with a chart in his hand, became Elena's most relentless student, turning up for every drill, asking her questions she could see cost him his pride to ask. And he would, in the years to come, become a genuinely excellent emergency physician, the kind who stays calm when the room comes apart, and he would tell the story. When he taught the ones who came after him of the night a triage nurse stepped onto a chair and stopped a room full of dying people from drowning, and he would always end it the same way, by telling them that the most important person in any room is almost never the one with the most letters after their name, and that they had better learn to find that person fast, because someday their life would depend on it. Dana, who had knelt so carefully over the wrong patient, never again mistook thoroughness for judgment, and she became, of the two of them, the one with the gift for triage, the one who could walk into chaos and feel where the dying were, and she learned it from the woman who had pulled her gently off that first stable man and taught her to walk past the screaming. The young man with the crushed leg came back. It took months and surgeries and a long, hard road, but he kept the leg, and one afternoon he walked back into the department on 2 crutches and a great deal of stubbornness to find the nurse who had knelt in the wreckage and held his hand and told him every hurt was a thing that would get him home. He found her at the triage desk, of course, where she always was, and he did not make a speech, because she was not a woman who would have known what to do with a speech. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you for not letting go," and Elena, who had held the hands of more frightened people than she could count across half the world, felt something move in her that she did not let show, and she told him to sit down before he fell down, and she checked his vitals out of pure habit, 2 steady fingers on his wrist, and she told him he was healing well, and he was. He asked her, before he left, the question everyone eventually asked, where she had learned to do what she did, and this time, for once, she gave a little more of the answer than usual. She told him she had learned it in some hard places, from some good people, most of whom did not get to come home, and that bringing him home had been, in a way he would never fully understand, a way of bringing a piece of them home too. He did not press. He was, by then, someone who understood that some things are carried and not explained. He nodded, the way the paramedic had nodded, the way people who have been to the edge of something nod at each other, and he went back out into his second life, the one she had given him. Nadia knew the most, in the end, because Nadia had always known the most, and after that night the two of them never spoke of it directly. But something settled between them that had not needed words before, and needed them even less now. Nadia simply started leaving a second cup of coffee on the triage desk at the start of every evening shift, the small mundane ritual of one person telling another that they are seen, and Elena drank it, and that was the whole conversation, and it was complete. The cocky new hire who had once called Elena the burned-out old triage lady transferred to days a few weeks later, and before he left he came and found her and could not quite meet her eyes and mumbled something about being sorry, about not having known. And Elena, who had heard 100 versions of that apology from 100 people who had underestimated her and lived to learn better, told him the same thing she always told them, which was that it was all right, that nobody knows what anybody else has carried, and that the only thing that matters is what you do the next time you are wrong about someone. He went away looking like a man who had been given something he did not deserve, which is the only kind of grace there is. And the hospital, in its slow institutional way, tried to make it official. There was talk of a commendation, a ceremony, a plaque with her name on it in the lobby, and the Regional Disaster Authority wanted to bring her in to help write the new mass casualty protocols for the whole network, which she agreed to, because that was the work, and the work was the point. But the plaque, the ceremony, the public naming of what she had done, all of that she quietly declined. And the people who knew her best understood why, because the recognition she had needed had already happened, in the only currency that had ever meant anything to her. On the worst night of that department's life, when a gray old commander she had never met had looked at the tourniquet on her chest and known what it meant, and brought his hand up in a slow salute, and when a senior surgeon had stood in front of her with his pride in his hands and said I was wrong, and when a young man had walked back in on 2 crutches and said thank you for not letting go. That was the medal. People who do what she had done do not get medals. They get to go home. And they get, if they are very lucky, one night where the room finally sees them, and then they get to go back to the quiet, which is where they were always most themselves. It is worth asking before the story closes why a person like Elena Marsh chooses the quiet at all. Why someone who had run the worst scenes on earth, who could have parlayed those years into a podium and a title and a place at the front of any room she wanted, would instead clip a name tag to a Navy scrub top and take the most invisible job in a community hospital and let a man like Whitlock call her furniture for 4 years, without ever once setting him straight. The easy answer, the wrong one, is that she was broken, that the field had hollowed her out, and the triage desk was where the hollow people go to hide. But that was not it, and Nadia, who watched her closest, knew it was not it. The truth was harder and quieter and more like grace. Elena had spent 8 years in places where every single day was the worst day of someone's life, where the need was bottomless and the resources were nothing, and you saved who you could and carried the rest. And she had learned out there exactly what she was capable of and exactly what it cost. And she had decided, when she finally came home with Marcus's coin in her pocket and his letter folded against her heart, that she did not need the world to keep telling her she was extraordinary. She knew what she was. She had nothing left to prove to anyone, which is the rarest and most dangerous kind of freedom a person can have, because it cannot be taken from you and it cannot be bought, and it makes you completely, serenely unbothered by the Whitlocks and the Mercers of the world who run on exactly the opposite fuel, on the constant need to be told that they matter. She had chosen the triage desk because the work was honest and the need was real, and because every single shift, someone frightened and hurting came through those doors, and she got to be the calm, steady, competent hand that met them. And that to her was not a step down from the field. It was the field, distilled to its purest form, the next necessary thing, one person at a time, no medals, no podium, just the work and the people and the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she was needed, unseen and unbothered and entirely herself. There is a thing the people who run the world by titles never understand about the people who run it by competence, and it is the thing this whole story has been circling, so it should be said plainly before the end. The titled believe that recognition is the point, that the salute and the plaque and the name said out loud are the reward that the work is paid in, and so they cannot comprehend a person who does the work without needing the pay, and they mistake that person's silence for the silence of someone with nothing to say, when it is the silence of someone who already has everything that matters. The systems we build to sort the important from the unimportant, the letters after the name, the title on the coat, the line on the organizational chart, are useful most of the time on the ordinary Thursdays when the patients come one at a time and the problems arrive tidy out of a textbook. But they are not the truth. They are a map of the truth, and like all maps, they are wrong in exactly the places that matter most. And the night the train comes off the rails, the night the building comes down, the night the wave arrives that the systems were never built to hold, the map fails, and all that is left is the territory. And in the territory, the only thing that has ever mattered is whether the person in front of you knows what to do, and whether they will keep their head when everyone else loses theirs, and whether they will walk past the screaming to reach the silent and make the terrible arithmetic out loud and hold the line until the sun comes up. Titles cannot do that. Only people can do that. And the people who can are almost never the people the room has decided to look at. A few weeks after the night of the derailment, on an ordinary evening before an ordinary shift, Elena Marsh sat alone for a while in the quiet of the empty break room as the last of the day's gold light came slanting low through the window and lay across the table. She had a soft cloth in her hands and the worn black tourniquet on the table in front of her, off her lanyard for once. And she was cleaning it, slowly, the way she did every so often, working the cloth into the windlass and along the strap gone pale and soft at the edges from 16 years of hard days, and beside it on the table sat the small, dull challenge coin, and beside that, unfolded, soft and worn through at the creases, sat the letter. She did not need to read it. She knew every word, but she read it anyway, the way you visit a grave, the blunt, careful handwriting of a big, calm, unhurried man who had taught her to walk past the screaming and had not, himself, gotten to go home, the man whose whole legacy she carried, smooth against her chest every single day, so that strangers in the worst hours of their lives could have the steady, competent hands he had given her. If she was reading it, then it had happened. She was not to carry the weight of the ones they could not save. The work was the next person, always and only the next person. Do the next necessary thing, and then the one after that, and that is the whole of it. That is how you carry it, one necessary thing at a time, until the sun comes up. She sat with it as the gold light faded toward dusk, 38 years old, 16 of them spent with her hands inside other people's worst days, and she let herself feel, for just a few minutes, the full weight of all of it. Marcus and the coin and the marketplace and the collapse line and the train 2 blocks away and the woman in the red zone she had not been able to save and the young man on 2 crutches who had walked back in to say thank you for not letting go. She let herself feel it, and then, the way she had learned, she set it down. She folded the letter along its soft, worn creases and slid it back into the inside pocket over her heart. She picked up the small, dull coin and turned it over once, the way she always did, and clipped it back onto the faded webbing loop. And then she picked up the worn black tourniquet, the gym teacher's toy, the battlefield gadget, the personal equipment not approved by the supply committee, the only grave she had, and she clipped it back onto the loop beside the coin where it belonged, and she snapped the lanyard straight, and she squared her shoulders, and she stood up, because it was almost time to open the queue. And somewhere out beyond the doors, the ordinary evening rush of a city was already on its way in. The chest pains and the broken wrists and the feverish students, the gentle catalog of human trouble, and on most nights that was all it would ever be. But she would carry the tourniquet anyway. She would always carry the tourniquet, because the day she stopped carrying it would be the day she needed it, and because somewhere a man had once told her that people who do what she did do not get medals, they get to go home. And going home, for Elena Marsh, had always meant going back to the desk at the front of the building where the frightened people came through the doors and being the calm in the room, unseen and steady and ready for the next one and the one after that. So here is what I will leave you with. The question I have been turning over since I first heard this story, and I would truly like to know how you land on it, because I do not think there is an easy answer. The next time you are in a room full of credentials and confidence, full of the people the world has lifted up and the systems everyone has learned to trust, and something begins, quietly, to go wrong, who are you going to be? Are you going to be one of the ones who keeps trusting the title and the protocol and the loudest voice in the room right up until the moment it all fails? Or are you going to be the one who looks for the quiet, competent soul at the edge of it, the steady pair of hands everyone else has written off, and asks her what she sees and learns? The way a department full of brilliant people learned on the night a train came off the rails that the most important person in the room is almost never the one the room has decided it is. Competence does not announce itself, and the quietest hands in the building are so often the ones holding it up. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Quiet courage, finally recognized. If this one stood you at attention, stay for the next, and tell me in the comments who you would salute.